No, and I think it's a question of if you wanted to bring them closer.
The length of time it takes people to become quiet is directly, positively correlated with how good the thinking's going to be, so that's a good sign. My name is Liz Mosley. I'm an editor here at Tortoise. This is the Tortoise Media Newsroom, and you're very, very welcome. Thank you for being here on a crisp and chilly March Friday morning for a ThinkIn with the really very simple question, and we probably won't need the whole hour. How can we achieve global gender equality? Feels very straightforward to me. We're here with some extraordinary expert speakers, and this ThinkIn is brought to you in partnership with the One Campaign, and Gayle Smith next to me is the CEO of the One Campaign, and we'll hear from them. Can I just get a quick show of hands as who has not been to a ThinkIn before? Okay, so I'll do a bit of blurb about what this is. Tortoise is a different kind of newsroom. We've been going for about a year, and we're a membership organisation that set out to break some of the kind of precious golden rules of journalism, and that we're not interested in going fast, we're interested in going slow and looking at what's driving the news rather than breaking stories. And also we are an open newsroom. So traditionally, newspapers and news organisations conduct things behind closed doors. Secrecy and privacy is a sort of precious tenet of the way they operate. And at Tortoise, we're much more interested in hearing what people who are not journalists think about issues that we care about and that we think are shaping the world that we report on. And so we do that through these things. It's called a ThinkIn, and it is effectively our editorial conference where we're looking to crowdsource, if you like, ideas, perspectives and examples from people who are living in the world on questions that we set ourselves. And so this morning, although we will hear from Mandu and Gayle and Nimco, I really want to hear as much as we can from you all, because we're here to talk about thinking the unthinkable and doing things differently that will change the direction of travel and or accelerate the direction of travel if we feel like we're going in the right direction in achieving global gender equality. So if you want to say something, please do. We are recording today. These things dangling down from the ceiling are mics and there are cameras. So that just to be aware of, put your phone on silent. And then I have colleagues, Gary at the back and Kerry over here. After this conversation concludes, we'll be making a podcast of the conversation we've had. So if you say something particularly interesting and brilliant, they may approach you at the end to ask you to say it again, but this time with a microphone closer to your face so that we can capture it in a good quality for the podcast. We will run for an hour. This tortoise here is called Agatha, named after James's pet tortoise, and she will make her way from the left to the right, and that's how we keep to time. So don't wait to say the thing that if you have a brilliant and genius idea, particularly say it quickly, because when she puts her flag up at the end, we stop. Is there anything else I need to say before on housekeeping? No, I think we're good to go. So who saw yesterday the publication of this report? Did anybody spot this? It was reported variously in various different news organisations. And as is traditional for news organisations, they picked out a few of the scariest and most horrible facts from it. The Guardian ran with 91% of men and 86% of women hold at least one bias against women in relation to politics, economics, violence or reproductive rights. And 1/3 of people, that's men and women, think it's okay for a man to beat his wife. And I could sit here for the whole hour and read out unpleasant, horrible, frightening statistics about how the progress towards gender equality isn't what we would like it to be, given the effort that has gone into achieving it from certain people. I would like to get a sense from the people in the room, just in a show of hands way, about your level of optimism regarding progress towards gender equality relative to how you felt about it in, let's say, 2015. So in the last 5 years, do you now feel more optimistic about how it's going? Put your hand up if you feel optimistic relative to 5 years ago about how it's going for global gender equality. And then if you feel worse, close run thing. I think on balance, the optimists have it. Okay, so those of you who just had your hand up and say you feel not as good now as you did 5 years ago, put your hands back up again. Let's come to you. Hello, what's your name?
My name's Wallace.
Hi, Wallace. Why?
I think for me there has just been a really scary rise in kind of global right nationalism, and with that comes kind of misogyny and kind of patriarchal views that particularly I think on like reproductive values, reproductive rights.
Yeah.
So I actually campaign with reproductive organisations, so that's kind of where my aspects where it comes from. So yeah, I think I was more in the middle, and I think my friend here as well. So I think I'm hoping to be maybe changed after the end of the session.
Okay, thank you. Let's take another person who's feeling less good now than they did 5 years ago. Let's have there were some hands over there. Who's going to be brave and say why? Come on. Hello, what's your name?
Hi, I'm Poppy.
Hi, Poppy. Why do you feel worse?
I think there's been progress on some issues like income equality and sort of some things that are sort of talked about in the media every day, but violence against women feels like it's making no progress, and I think more women were murdered by their partners in England, in the UK the last year than ever before, since we've been reporting it.
Okay, because it's difficult. There's no one measure, I guess, is there? And so it feels like you're sort of 2 steps forward and 1 step back. So I'll come to Gayle. Gayle Smith is CEO of the One Campaign. Could you unpack for us, perhaps, Gayle, some of the reasons why progress is a mixed bag? What are the things that frustrate progress? Because it's not the same everywhere, right? Some countries are doing brilliantly on some measures and some aren't. Could you help us understand?
Right, but there are very few countries that are there. And if you look at global aggregates of all the data, at the current rate of progress, it'll take 99.5 years to achieve global gender equality, which is a really exciting thing to tell your kids, kid, right? Thrilled. So to me, the question is, I find a lot of the debate and discussion about this is what I refer to as admiring the problem. And the question to me is what are the points of entry that may be different, that get to some of the reasons this is not an area where we're seeing the kind of sustained change that we need? And I think there are kind of 3 things I would throw out on that. There are very few places where gender equality is in any way compelled. It's predominantly a voluntary measure. And if you think about other struggles for equality and equity, there has more often been a heavy hand of laws, regulations, and requirements. So I think one of the reasons is we leave a lot of this to voluntary. It would be really great if you educated girls, as opposed to creating any expectation, norm, regulation, or law. Equal pay is another example. The second is, while I think it's critically important that we frame the issue in terms of rights, because at the most fundamental level, it is about equity, fairness, and justice. I think we sometimes do that. One of the reasons we don't see as much progress as we might is we don't measure also what the financial cost of inaction is, right? So the Secretary General gave a big speech on gender equality recently, where he talked about how horrible it is that the world has made such little progress, and he noted very eloquently that it is also stupid. So if you look at current data, and you did a best-in-region scenario, this is data from McKinsey, so that if every country in a region followed the best performer in that region, that would add $12 trillion to global GDP by 2025. So it's the right thing to do. It's also the smart thing to do. And I think it's hard to measure doing the right thing. It's hard for citizens to engage as much on doing the right thing. I think giving people measures. The last thing I would question is, I think, because you rightly point out, and in that report it's evident, there's progress here, there's no progress here, there's progress here. Do we need to think about focusing in specific areas? And I'm not sure what I think about that, but I think it's worth thinking through. And one I would point to is STEM and technology. Because if you look at where we are on that, we're not where we need to be, and that means 2 things. It means that women and girls are not sufficiently represented in the sector. It also means then the sector and everything that comes with it, whether it's AI or algorithms or everything else, are being designed by a portion of our society as opposed to the
Yeah.
whole.
Yeah.
So I would, progress is uneven, I think, because we're a mile wide and an inch deep. We're trying to do everything everywhere, and maybe we need to focus, monetize it a little bit, and think more about calling for it, but also compelling.
Yeah. One of the things we really want to do this morning in this conversation is to talk specifically about possible answers. And in our briefing calls and prep and things for the ThinkIn this morning with the One campaign, we've talked a lot about where progress is good. We can be proud of that and we can support it and we can try to accelerate it. But it would seem that 99.5 years isn't an acceptable number.
It's not so good.
We kind of need to do something different than just go faster on the things we're already doing. And what Gayle talks about particularly is that thing about compelling people, the voluntariness of equality, to me seems to be a really big problem. And I'd love to hear from you, and we've got some things that we can throw out, we don't need to decide now, but some ideas about how we might just completely change the framing of the conversation. I thought I might come to Nimco. Nimco Ali, who's a prominent campaigner, particularly around the issue of FGM, and talk about, one of the sentences that gets said quite a lot is that in a system that was built by men, men ain't gonna fix it. And I'm really interested, because we can say, take an example of a country like Rwanda. Actually, could we flick to this slide that has the quadrants on it, that is really interesting, lifted from this report that came out yesterday, that shows some of the countries measured and their sort of rate of progress. I'll do this because I haven't got my glasses on, so I can't see the screen. Countries where equality is generally better on the top right, and they're going in a reasonably a good rate of progress. And then the bottom right, you've got lower levels of gender equality, but it's getting better faster. And then the same on the other side. And notably, the United States on the top left, in general, relative to other countries, gender equality in the United States isn't so bad, but it's going slower in recent times, to your point, Wallace, potentially. And then the sort of worst countries to be a woman, I guess, sort of Bangladesh, Senegal, Dominican Republic of Congo. And what's interesting, I think, about this data is that there are real standout examples where things have moved faster in recent years, and yet there are many places where it's just stuck. And I wonder, Nimco, if you could unpack some of those, kind of cultural, belief-based, values-based reasons why people just don't want to change.
Great, thank you, because I thought you were going to use Rwanda as an example. I always like to clarify the reason why there are more women in power in Rwanda is because a lot of the men died to a civil war. So I think one of the key things is that we shouldn't celebrate Rwanda as a gender equal society, because that gender equality came as a factor of genocide. It's really, so the reality is that I always have this African saying, and it's interesting to be at a place called Tortoise, is to say, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go, if you want to go far, go together. Mm-hmm. And for the first time ever, the survival of white men is dependent on gender equality, because we know that the environmental crisis means that their basically existence and their future depends on equality. And I think for me is, I can have a conversation and say the fact that we need women to be leaders, we need to do these things, but in terms of the pipeline, that's not happening. And we've just seen that in the next US election, there's going to be two men who are going to be campaigning. One thing's office, dad, uncle, pervy uncle, banter is fine. The other one thing's like grabbing a woman by the pussy is okay. So the reality that either of those two men have my best interests is not a reality, but the reality is the fact that both of those two men will want to have conversations with women like me, women on the African continent, in order for America and the world to survive. So in the whole this is the reason why I'm optimistic, is the fact that for the first time in decades, 4,000 years actually, something like FGM can tangibly end in the next 10 years. And one of the things is unless we end something like FGM, because everybody says to me, oh, you're just such a single issue activist. I'm like, it's not a single issue, because the reality is when there's girls like, in the poorest countries in the world. And they're poor because of the fact that you're subjecting a girl to something like FGM, when there's girls in the poorest country in the world being tied down and cut at the age of 5 so that's how they can be sold. There is no way that a woman in America is going to get access to equal pay, equal opportunities, all these things. So in order for us in this side of the world to really be successful, we have to be speaking up for women who don't have a voice. So I'm not sure what my real point is, the fact that I'm believing in a lot of white men at the moment, and I think that's something really weird for an African woman to be saying. But I do think that the 2030 targets can be reached, and I think we have to be optimistic about that. And then we also have to be strategic about it. So the reality of like financial growth, having kind of those conversations, are things that the FTSE 100 companies are interested in, but those are things that depend on women like me and the continent that I'm from. So the reality is like Africa's population is the one that's probably most struggling with the issues of gender inequality, but they're also the ones that I am the most hopeful for.
Interesting. So the point you made is interesting about the engagement and possible role of the FTSE 100. Let's take that as a group of people led largely by white men, as it turns
Named John
out.
or Paul.
And
But
and so how do you figure that? What is the role of business in this?
The whole point is like if they want to make money and they want to keep their bottom lines as they are at the moment, then they have to be investing in places like Africa and really investing in women's education. And I think one of the the reason my colleague and I started a foundation a year and a half ago called the 5 Foundation is the Global Partnership to End FGM. And one of those things was the fact that I was at a massive conference and they kept talking about poverty, poverty, poverty. And then they put up a slide of where poverty was going to go up in the next decade, or double or triple in the next decade. Every single country had an uptake of FGM, 40% uptake of FGM. Girls weren't in education. So the reality is that if you want African countries, mostly African countries, to not be in poverty, 50% of the human capital cannot be shackled through FGM, early forced marriage, all these things. And the reality is I can make the case of business to a businessman than to an aid development organisation. So the reality is that the private sector actually has a massive role and a bigger role on the continent of Africa, which I'm really interested in terms of really ending gender inequality than aid organisations do. So one of the key things is the fact that if you want the flow from the African continent to stop, invest in Africa. So I know somebody said that there's a rise in nationalism and white supremacy and all these other kind of conversations. I'm concerned about that, but then at the same time, you can play that to your advantage. If you don't want people on your shores, invest in Africa. All these countries, so our 0.7% is something that I'm incredibly proud of, but our 0.7% doesn't at the moment touch the ground and the grassroots organisations. If you want to stop women having, Macron said, he said, no, everybody misquoted him saying African women shouldn't have 8 kids. And he corrected himself. He said, no, give me an African woman who's chosen to have 8 kids. The reality is that African women are having 8 kids because they don't have access to education, employment, or contraception. If you don't want the population of Nigeria to be 500 million by 2050, it's not about talking about how aid should be spent. It's about actually getting trade and aid to work together. So the reality is businessmen understand this. So businessmen are the ones that can really address gender inequality as opposed to people that want to keep talking about the development conversation. So I've had multiple conversations in development for the last 7-8 years, but the people that really got it were the heads of Morgan Stanley, the heads of all the banks, all the investment banks, because they want to make sure that the investment pays out in the next 10 years. And I'm not angry about that.
Money's a powerful motivator. And maybe we can come back to some other ways that we can pull that lever too. Gayle, do you work closely with the...
I'd say a couple things on this. I think part of what's happening in the private sector is that they are feeling a lot of pressure, right? And if you look at the changes we're starting to see in some of the private sector, they're getting feedback from consumers that there's an expectation of sustainability and equity along value chains. Interestingly, there is growing data to suggest that major CEOs are getting a lot of pressure from their children, which is having an impact. And I think part of it, as you suggest, part of it's a bottom line issue, is that there's a growing recognition that if you are not investing in a way that fosters sustainability and breeds equity, you're going to pay a higher price for that over time. That's number one. Number two, I mean, to your point on investing in Africa, the return is tremendous. And the return on investment is tremendous. So it's also a very smart thing to do. I think a couple of distinctions that are important and provide opportunities for women, though these are not things that we've solved yet. The other issue is creating jobs and creating decent work. The majority of jobs come, in fact, from small enterprises. And so one of the other questions is, what are ways to empower and enable those women and men who can start the small businesses that may employ 10 and then 30 and then 60 and 100 people? Because Morgan Stanley coming in is going to have an impact, and that's a macro impact that I wouldn't discount. But if you look at the demand, for example, in Africa for jobs, being able to also kind of get to scale at the SME level is key. Now, what that requires, in addition to people getting that it makes good sense, is if you think about standing access and voice, do women have the standing, the legal standing to acquire and get credit, right? Do they have the access? Are there instruments and financial tools? And there aren't enough of these anywhere. This is as true in the United States or the UK as it is in Africa, of having the kinds of investment instruments you need for small and medium enterprises.
Yeah.
And then do they have the voice to start shaping the policy? And I think we're seeing a lot of places where there's progress across all three. But I think there is an opening in the growing recognition of the private sector that there's a big market here. But we also got to start doing things a little bit differently, or the broad masses are going to come get us.
Okay, please put your hands in the air if you want to add anything to the discussion as you go, because I'm going to keep trucking on. There's a ton to get through. If we can go to the next slide, and I'm going to come to Mandu. So these blobs, if you want to see it nearer to your face, Mandu.
Oh, thanks.
This is all new data, because the report frustratingly came out about 4 hours after our print deadline for the notes. So sorry about the fact that your printed thing doesn't have the data in it. This is a mapping for 2001 to 2018, women in parliaments and cabinets by global region. And if I, as a sweeping glance, I look at that and I think, well, high fives all round, everyone. That all looks like it's moving in the right direction. Mandu Reid is leader of the UK Women's Equality Party and is running for Mayor of London.
Yeah.
Hashtag Mandu for Mayor. Mandu for Mayor. That's what the hashtag is. You obviously know a ton of stuff about this. Just talk to us about, we've mentioned the role of business in the private sector, but politics and policy has a massive role to play.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely part of the equation. But let's take a little step back. We're here because it's sort of International Women's Day, which is like feminist Christmas, isn't it? So let's just reflect for a moment on feminism. For me, feminism is fundamentally about fairness, freedom, and everyone fulfilling their potential. Now, I challenge you to come up with a coherent and polite sentence that contains more F words than that. But I think all the things that have already been discussed are absolutely part and parcel of getting us to that destiny. But one of the things that I think is really, really important to examine comes when you know that old adage: if you wanna like bust an organized crime network, follow the money. Yeah. Now, if you wanna bust male supremacy and misogyny and sexism, follow the power. And what I mean by follow the power is examine where and how it's distributed, examine where and how it's concentrated, and also take note of the environments and situations where power is abused. And those of you who wield power, and I'm looking at the guys here because, you get a head start on the rest of us in the typical situation, look for ways to share your power. Because when we're thinking in those terms, we start to move towards a situation where the pace of change we're all talking about, this is good, it's moving in the right direction, but it's too slow. I like my job, but on some ways I'd kind of like to be lying on a beach in Barbados because the Women's Equality Party isn't needed anymore. Our work, though, is very much about trying to create mechanisms and an atmosphere where women who don't have an equal share of power see themselves in positions where there's, and little girls too, where they're able to imagine that it's possible for them, where they feel, it's not, a lot of the time, I even feel this, I feel like I have to ask permission a lot of the time, and I realize permission just to speak, and I've got a big loud voice and I'm a talkative person, but I've been socialized, as many women will have, in a way that means it's not my starting point to use my voice, express myself, and contribute. Women aren't always in positions to contribute to the decision making that affects all of us. And so I think you can talk about the role of business, you can talk about the role of aid, but you have to, alongside those things, be looking for ways to equalize how power is distributed and shared. And politics is part of that, and all of this stuff is great because it's about parliament, but power isn't only about how government works and who has a role in government. There's power distribution and power dynamics in communities that are relevant. And so I think there's so many ways we can kind of explore and unpick this, but I think what I want to know from people here, and I'm really interested in your thoughts about this, is when you're looking at power, when you're looking at a country like the UK and comparing it to almost any sub-Saharan African country, that's my background too. I was born in Malawi, that's where my mother's from. What is it that we could all kind of stop and take stock of that would improve the power distribution and get us on a path where we're moving towards equality between men and women at an accelerated rate? Because we like to give ourselves a round of applause here, but there's still so much work to do. And actually, I think there's things that we could all incorporate into what's normal, and the things we could jettison about what's normal that sort things out for us. And the last example I want to give is this idea of how we judge whether a country or a community is successful. You can call it tradition, I suppose. This tradition of GDP being the way that we judge the success of a society is fine, but I think it's outdated. And when you look at New Zealand, Scotland, Iceland, it's not a coincidence, I think, that all those countries are headed by women. They're all taking their countries on a path towards looking at well-being as a way of judging the success of their societies and their countries. So it isn't simply about, what does the balance sheet say? What does the spreadsheet say in terms of how much cash is concentrated in these really traditional ways? They're looking at it in a much broader way. And the beauty of that is it captures things like unpaid care, that we all know women are disproportionately bearing the burden of doing. In this country alone, women's unpaid care work contributes an invisible, if you look at the spreadsheets that the Treasury examined to make their decisions, an invisible 77 billion to the economy. And so when you have more women in charge, the framing changes. And that helps us move to where we need to get to when you consider everything Nimco said and everything that's been discussed about how aid has a role to play too, and organizations like the One Foundation have a role to play in coordinating this stuff across the world.
Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty of some ideas. Mandu's thrown one in there, which is forget GDP, we need a different measure, or if we're still going to go with GDP, we need to include all of the value that is generated, not just the stuff that has a pound or whatever attached to it, but the unpaid stuff too. That segues neatly into what if that unpaid work was paid? We're here to talk about, radical and different ideas, but what if we didn't just accept that care work was unpaid and notionally valued because Sophie Walker, the Young Women's Trust, has done a brilliant campaign which helps us all to see what it's worth. What if there was for example, universal basic income for women? How do people feel about that kind of thinking? Tessa?
I think we overdid a general strike, but we're going to call it a gender strike this time around, and we are simply going to stop delivering on unpaid labour until we're paid for it.
That's a really good example, because I said that yesterday at an event. There were 2 strikes. One was in Liberia, and there's a documentary about that called Praying the Devil Back to Hell, where the Muslim and the Christian women got together and said, we're the ones that are being raped, being killed, our sons are going to war, like, we're just sick of this. Let's like, basically get together and make peace. And then there was Iceland, where women, because there was a woman within construction that was on the panel, and she was talking about how the unflexibility of the construction industry meant that her job meant that she couldn't work on a Saturday, all these things. And I said, like, these men can work on a Saturday because they have women and everybody else to pick up that slack. So the reality is, yes, there is these conversations that are happening. There are unpaid work that's happening on a day-to-day basis. So I do agree with you on the strike, but also I think the GDP point is quite important.
I think that's a really good one.
Because, for example, if you look at global prosperity, if we mark it on how much money people are getting as opposed to how free their worlds are. So for example, China, people have more money in their pockets today in China, but they have less freedoms. So the reality is, would you want to have $10 in your pocket rather than 20, but still have the ability to be able to Google search your mum or whatever you want to do? So I'm not saying porn or whatever you want to do, everybody else is on Google, but I think the reality is those are the kind of things that we have to kind of balance is a fact that, and I do say that these commercial industries, so the banking and everything else, do have a role to play, but again, the real value that it gives back is the kind of conversations that we need to be having. So then again, when it goes into development and trade and conversations in Africa and places like that, do we want to level up the money that's in the pocket of communities, but without actually ensuring that we protect the human rights of those countries? And that's why, for me, we've been having conversations about China's role in Africa at the moment. So China does not have the interests of women in its, like, you know, in any of the businesses that it's doing, and the African leaders, who are mostly men, don't have the interest in those things. So that's why on this side of the planet, our aid and our trade conversations have to be in line with our global prosperity and our global security, to say, well, if Africa is one of the largest continents, the youngest continent, with a growing population, who do you want to be able to influence that? And I think GDP is one thing, but looking at freedoms within the continent is a good thing as well.
Yeah. Because
Can I just ask, going back to the issue
So
of
what's your name?
strike? I'm sorry, no, just to understand, because you said, let's strike until we get paid. Who would pay?
Yeah, I mean, it's a slightly kind of facetious comment, but the point is, if you draw attention to the sheer volume of labour that is carried out every day without being either recognised through GDP or just acknowledged as work rather than duty or a gender expectation, it's about, here are the choices. We go back to universal basic income. We have it recognised in the tax credit system, in some, as you do with carers or a child benefit. But there's something that needs to shine a really strong light on the sheer volume and the fact that this is not recognised formally in any way in the economy, and yet the entire economy is so dependent on it happening. I'm just lobbing it into the air. I don't know what way of sort of sparking that conversation and the visibility of the value and the volume of that work is. But, you know, I wouldn't mind putting my feet up for a weekend to prove a point, you know?
Well, I think there's a need for something, whether it is a strike or a protest, that looks different than just a lot of women getting together on a Saturday.
Yeah.
It's a little, right? There's got to be some slightly in-your-face thing, but I think you're right, because you got to. It's a symbolic gesture, but I think it gets to the GDP point, because what we measure matters. And if you look at the amount of gender disaggregated data out there, it's not incorporated into anything. And if you start measuring and talking about losses, so that when people are talking about what expectations of growth in the global economy are, if you're tracking unpaid labor, right, and if you're tracking net losses of trillions of dollars because of disparity, you start having a different conversation. That's a hard thing to do, but I think something like measuring GDP differently is something people could get interested in. I think there are ways to create some demand. I mean, Christine Lagarde tried to do some of this when she was at the IMF, in terms of talking about global growth and saying, and by the way, there's some hidden data here. The question becomes, how do you popularize that enough that it isn't just a discussion among people who are reading the FT, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and I think a strike's brilliant. Let's do it. A little bit busy this weekend, but talk to me after. The other thing that I like about the concept of a strike relates to the point I made about how power's shared, because maybe we accept that, you know, there's going to be some really important essential work that's going to happen that's going to be unpaid. But the question is, who's doing it, right? What about the distribution of that unpaid work? Why is it that it's overwhelmingly women who do that work? If we're going to accept that our economy requires it, whatever measures we're using and whatever measures of success are there, we need to draw attention to who's carrying the burden and what the kind of cost is, what the opportunity cost is of making it something that is almost solely down to women. And I think that so you draw attention to let's measure GDP or whatever it is differently, but you also draw attention to the fact that you know what, we can not only share power, we can share some of the things that are the essential building blocks of like care in general of a healthy society.
I was just going to say that the fact that as much as I had this thought in the sense that, like, you know, as key as business is to this global conversation. So one thing is the fact that I just thought if we go on strike in this side of the kind of the world where democracy and everything else exists, these companies that are going to make money are going to go to India and China where there's slave labor. So there are more people enslaved right now than anywhere, like, you know, in any time in history. And one of the key things is that you have to make it the fact that it has to be a strategic thing. So for example, I know another big company which their product only grows in a certain place in the hemisphere. So they can't say, well, if these people go on strike, that we're going to move and do something else. So when it came to issues about women putting their tools out and being paid, they were like, we can't move to China to do this, so we're going to be able to, we're going to have to kind of do things. So I think our conversation about striking means that if it impacts global business and the bottom line, again, so this is the whole thing about the bottom line, they can be helpful when you work with them, but when you work against them, they can also push back really hard. So the reality is the fact that somebody was talking about making something in this country compared to making it in China. What's the issue? I'm like, slave labor. It's cheaper because China doesn't pay people equally, whether they're women or men. So I think the conversation is that, and again, coming back to privilege, we could strike.
Yes.
But who's going to take on that burden?
The work goes somewhere. Hello, some hands at the back. Hiya, what's your name?
David.
Hi, David.
It was just, I was struck by the point around the strike and the and that sort of the unpaid labour. And so I do a lot of work around fatherhood, and if you look at the sort of the way people's views of masculinity are changing, you see that like consistently over 90% of surveys run across like 20 plus countries say that men want to be more involved, dads, and that actually they see that as a real part, like a core part of what it means to be a man, as opposed to the sort of the traditional, 80s sort of stereotype. And I think with one of the challenges with equality when you look at some of the sort of HRE kind of data is that you see there's a sort of growing sentiment from a certain type of man that sees it as a sacrifice and a loss. Like, well, I've got to give something up here in order for this thing to happen. And you can, if you, I also do a bit of work in like organisational change. You speak to some people in HR and they say, yeah, there is a kind of problem brewing here because the people that are kind of bringing this sentiment up tend to be pretty senior, of a certain age, certain demographic, etc. And yet, so we've got this story of a kind of sacrifice challenge going on. You've got a lot of men wanting to come up and take a carer role, which actually really benefits them because it means that the male identity moves from just being about work and your position in the organisation, how much you earn, to actually about your broader life. And I think there's a way to pull all these things together so it's a much more rounded story that actually, yes, this is equality for all of us. Okay, the current status that we've got, the picture looks like this. That's not okay. However, if we all work towards this, we all get something out of it. And there's a lot of men who do want to be more involved and pick up a lot of that unpaid labour because it means, from a fatherhood, familial perspective, they get a much better bond with their children and a much richer life. And that emotional story, if we're talking about changing behaviours and decisions, emotions are the thing that do it. The stats really do help put it on the table. They work in a business context, but at a human level, emotions are the thing that drive behaviours. So we can pull this story together in a richer way.
Person behind you with your hand up. Hello, what's your name?
My name's Marinissa.
Hi,
So
Marinissa.
what I found really interesting is we've been speaking a lot about formal things that we can do, and I think what's more interesting for me at this stage is what we can do sort of in terms of soft skills and also remodeling behaviour. And one of the things that I've noticed is, so my heritage is I'm part Pakistani and part Polish, and I grew up in Pakistan and then I moved to this country. And it was quite fascinating to me that I grew up with very strong female role models. My country also happened to have a female president long before lots of other Muslim countries did. So I think there is this issue around what people's lived experiences are versus what is actually happening on the top-down policy level, and I don't think that's really mixing. And I've noticed, like, just looking at this crowd here, there are a lot fewer men than there are women, whereas gender equality is about gender. It's not about, it's not about sex, for instance. And that I find really frustrating, because I feel like as a feminist, what's happening is when I talk to men about it, there's a lot of backlash, predominantly because they feel that they're not included in that debate. They see it very much as a women's rights movement. And I think we need to get better at having those cross conversations, because it's not helping us as women to work just as women. I'm not saying I don't want to have to carry men's burdens for them. I think they need to do the work. And I can see, like, for instance, what David was saying, there is a whole canon of men who want to do this, and that's not being represented in our structures. I'll give you a very small example from work. I work on inclusion as a champion, and HR doesn't call, they were thinking about family-friendly policies, and their entire skew was towards women. So I had to sit in the room and go, like, but what about gay men? What about fathers who want to be involved? Why are we not talking about shared parental leave? Why have we not been able to move the goalposts, even though things have moved on? So I think we really need to think about people who are coming, not young enough, not able to see those things, but we need to somehow integrate those conversations. I don't have a solution, but that's important.
There's a hand up there in the glasses. Hello. What's your name?
I'm Chris.
Hi, Chris.
I think it's actually, for me, it's a question that kind of goes from the personal to the policy of how mistakes and fallibility are kind of dealt with. And I would say that, I would challenge any men or any of the women in here that if they've never done a sexist thing, because I'm ashamed to say, but I know I have, because of like the patriarchal culture that I live in. But I think the same is true for policies, and the way that big kind of government approaches take place is that you are going to muck up, you are going to kind of fall down, and I think it's a test and learn to take ownership of whether it's your own individual kind of quality of, oh, I did that, I've got to take responsibility and I've got to do better, or on a government level, on a World Bank level, going, oh, actually this initiative we tried didn't work and it really didn't do that, and rather than kind of be defensive and go, oh, well, we tried our best, go, you know what, you're right, actually we could and should have done better. And I think that kind of can potentially engender a culture where gender equality is no longer thought of as a kind of defensive, oh, well, you didn't do as well as you could, but actually, oh, you know what, a motivation to do better.
But I think that should be. I think you can kind of avoid a situation where we're worrying about making mistakes, and I'm talking more. I'm not talking about at an individual level, maybe organisational level or big macro policy level. If your starting point is, hang on a minute, we're trying to do this thing. Can we examine right now, before we get started, the differential impact on men and women? Just start with that, and you're going to find yourself in a situation where you're producing better policy, where you're making better decisions, where you're putting in place organisational sort of structures, patterns, norms that serve everyone better.
Imagine it in a business. I've worked all my life in sort of media and publishing worlds, and you just wouldn't embark on any kind of initiative at all unless you've done, sometimes and not very thorough, P&L. I'm going to spend this money. Am I going to make any money back? Imagine if it was as much a default setting that you would do a kind of gender balance impact assessment before you set out on it. It would be fascinating and completely different.
But we don't do that. And I think one of the questions I have, we make the argument on the merits, like this is the right thing to do, bonehead, right? And
she looked at me when she said bonehead.
people make decisions and change their minds either because they suddenly get it and they're enlightened, or they're presented with facts that show them, despite what they may personally think, it is foolish not to do something else. And so I think part of the question becomes, because I think you're 1,000% right, we all, those of us who are fighting for this, have to be much better at saying, you should agree with me because I'm right, but you should also agree with me because you're going to lose money or market share or whatever it is if you don't get it right.
For sure. I'm going to come.
I wish right was enough.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's not.
I'm going to come to the lady here and then James at the back. Yes. What's your name?
I'm Josephine.
Hi, Josephine.
I'm not really sure what the solution would be, but I think there would need to be like a targeted approach, because sometimes when you see the figures, it seems like things are improving, but within like the women female group, there are variations. So there will be people who are more disadvantaged in that group. So just acknowledging that, because as things improve, things will get worse for the worst group, because that's been seen with like smoking during pregnancy. That more deprived people, it hasn't really improved that much, and now it's a stage where it's just mainly that group. So I think there needs to be an acknowledgement that there are variations within that.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. James.
I just wanted to follow up on the point about the money. It was the point that Mandu made at the beginning. So I'm James Harding. I'm one of Liz's fellow editors here, co-founder with Katie. One of the things really wound me up in the last couple of years are Larry Fink's letters. You don't know who Larry Fink is, he runs BlackRock, and he's now discovered purpose in capitalism. And one of the things that he says is that he wants all of BlackRock's investors, it's the largest owner of shares in companies in the world, to make sure that it meets their targets on purpose. And even within the active funds, i.e. the funds that are dedicated to looking at investment in environment, society and governance, only 0.3% of those funds have achieved what are BlackRock's anyway, only 30% target of female representation on boards. Right? But in that, I think there is something that is, to your point, Liz, a concrete solution or the pathway to something that is concrete. And I guess it picks up on your point, Gayle, of rather than just sort of persuading people with the argument, but shaming them with the facts of what they're actually doing. And I think there's a model that we should really think about, which sounds quite boring, but I think is a revolution, which comes from what's happened in climate. Right? So 10 years ago, when I grew up as a financial reporter, the idea that a central bank was going to measure other banks on what their carbon emissions were was just fanciful. And the idea that a central bank would measure banks on essentially what their social impact rather than just their financial performance was eccentric. But what they've done now with something called the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD, they essentially say, catchy, I know that's something exciting for me, but they essentially say, we, the central bank, are going to measure the way that all money moves related to carbon. And it just seems to me that they've opened a doorway there for thinking about the way all money moves related to all the things that we care about. And if you can do TCFD on carbon, you can do the same thing, it seems to me, on the way money moves in terms of investment and its extraordinary skew on gender. And so if you were thinking about a concrete thing, I would go and knock on the door of Mark Carney before he leaves in a fortnight.
And is the worst thing that can happen from the TCFD shame, or can you get fined as well?
Well, so your point right at the beginning, I think, is the key one, which is, are we voluntary or are we competitive? They've started with voluntary, and I think they'll move to mandatory.
Hello, Wallace again.
I just wanted to flag, because I think it's really interesting that we're talking about being strategic and obviously engaging with kind of business and FTSE 100 and things like that. But for me personally, I'm not sure how much I trust them in terms of like being this kind of force for good, and the fact that we always have to kind of monetize and have this like value of what kind of gender equality is. So for example, like if you're saying there's a case for gender equality but it doesn't meet the kind of business side of things, does that mean we shouldn't do it? And does that mean that business won't do it? And I think that that's the issue for me, is that I'm not sure how much I trust them, not trusted them to do it on climate, for example. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about kind of the disparity between that, because it seems to me that the actual structure in terms of how FTSE's set up isn't meant to kind of go for gender equality. It's about money and profits. And that sort of thing.
I think that, and I'm not suggesting that trust is the best way into this.
Okay.
I think the question becomes, we know what motivates business. They want to make a profit. We also know that we're seeing trend lines where consumers, shareholders, and children are putting pressure on them, and there's growing recognition, not fast enough, but that businesses are going to have to start to behave differently, or consumers are making different choices. The question is, how do we ride that wave to say, hey, it's the right thing to do, it's a matter of justice, and there's a constituency that cares about that. And by the way, from your own perspective, your own motivations, your own interests are at play here, because financially, it doesn't make any sense not to have the kind of parity. Now, I'll confess that where I come from, my entire life has been driven by the fact that the reason to do this is because it's right, and that the world needs to be fair. I've also learned over time that it's totally fine to divert on tactics to get somebody to do what they need to do. No, and I think that's it, is that my motivation on this is it's the right thing to do. You don't need to talk to me about money. Doesn't matter. I feel the same way about poverty. I feel the same way about racism. I feel the same way about all those issues that divide us and deny people their full potential. But tactically, if you take it back to power, which is what it's about, how do you get people in power to change? You try to persuade, you hold them accountable, and you fight them with facts.
It's like the Trojan, so no, I completely agree with you. It's like the Trojan horse of power. So the whole point is, one of the other sayings that I say is, seldom do you see the potential of a man in a boy, but you always fear the woman in a girl. And the fear of strong women, like let me come back to the continent of Africa, Africa's female future. I was on a panel yesterday and everyone kept going about white feminism and white men in the West. And I'm like, as an African...
Same conference.
Yeah, as an African... Yeah, no, but I said, as an African woman, I'm being raped, killed, and mutilated by African men. My enemies are not white men in the West. My enemies are my brothers, my uncles, and the people that don't want me to have power. And in order for me to argue with those men, I'm not going to talk to them about like the things that they're doing to me being wrong, because they've known this for 4,000 years and centuries. I'm going to have a conversation about them being richer. So we can sit around, and we've sat around for almost 30 years telling African communities and people that FGM is wrong. I'm telling you, women know holding a 5-year-old girl down and mutilating her is wrong. My mother, my grandmother, everybody's been through that pain. But if I don't have the ability to be educated or employed, and my only survival depends on a man feeding me, and he wants me to be mutilated, I'm going to be mutilated. So the reality is, talking to the Kenyan leader and saying, if you want to be richer, the greatest asset for you is to use the aid and the things that you're given in order to stop FGM and to do these things. So, and these FTSE 100s, and those are the conversations that I have with them, because I want that girl to be able to get to the age of 15, 14, 16, 17, and take a bit of that power without these men fearing her. So I think the whole point is that, yes, I don't trust all the men named Paul and all the men named John, but they hold the power that can ensure that the men in Africa don't fear young girls to the point where they have to mutilate them. So yeah, it is a Trojan horse tactic.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, we've got quite a few hands now. Hello, let's go with you first. What's your name?
So my name is Christiana.
Hi, Christiana.
Yeah, so I'm trying to agree with what she's trying to say about education. So I actually did a research that has to do with Africa, and I said that most of the things that are happening, the maternal mortality, the FGM, is because ladies are not educated. And this is because they don't really, when I did the research, people were asking me, is it that they teach maternal mortality in school, antenatal care in school, or FGM? But this is it. When you give a woman education, you are building a nation. Yeah. They tend to be able to do a research by themselves. They tend to get education, and they tend to go to they tend to get jobs where they can get money, and they don't need to rely on a man. And when you train a lady, she takes care of the family. She could actually say, she wants her children to go to school. But when you say a woman doesn't go to school, she doesn't see any reason why her daughter should actually go to school. And there's always this discrimination, because I come from an African country where you see a mother telling the daughter that she doesn't need to go to school because she'll still end up in the kitchen. And she spent almost all on the men. So that has always been like the roots, the foundation of the gender inequality, because they always place this more on the men to go to school and advance them, while they leave the women. And these are the people that are going to go back and build their own children. So if you don't train a woman, I don't see why that lady should also train a child. But if you train me, I'll actually train my children and they make them understand what they need to be empowered.
Katie?
I'll just be very quick. Hi, I'm Katie. I want to pick up on the measurement and then the reporting point. So I wrote down, actually, for me, here in the UK, I think we think about voice and value, but actually I hadn't thought about violence as much until I was in the room today, based on the stories that you were telling. So I argue I love a 3, you know a 3. If we were to measure the violence and the reduction of violence as a sort of construct of power and actually report on that, that's an interesting area. If we talk about voice, role models, voter turnout, politicians, leadership, whatever the roles are that show voices changing as a metric, but then value, and it all comes back to this point of unpaid workforce, potentially even, you know, the fact that you can now see that there is data. If you have more women on your boards, your company does better. You know, putting it into the system, which ultimately picks up on James's point, which is until this is something that is something people have to report on in their annual reports, in a way that, you know, now employee voice is part of an annual report, but the gender piece is there, but it isn't actually brought out into the money. Following the money piece, then I think actually if you were to measure differently and then report differently, you would have a massive impact.
Yeah. I'm going to take one more. There was a couple of hands over here. Was there? Yes, hello, sir.
Yeah, it's just
What's your name?
Helmut.
Hi, Helmut.
And it's just a point around education. I do believe education is power, and I just don't want one point to be very unclear. It's about STEM. Because I truly believe there's a correlation between STEM education and female equality. I think currently it's below 20% in the UK. I think that's probably a number which is true for the US as well. And I think this is, for me, the single most important thing, how to get more females into STEM very early on, because we educate many females into inequality by the choices they make. And I think this is, for me, the single most important lever, because the world needs more engineer. The big problems are engineering issues. So I think this is something which I believe is really important. I feel very strongly about that.
I attribute this to the Secretary General of the United Nations and not myself, but the other reason to do it is if you think about AI and all of the changes we're seeing in technology, we're presently positioned such that the way that is used is likely to reinforce inequality, number one, and is unlikely to come up with some of the solutions that if there were more women involved would probably be sought. So it's a structural opportunity, but it's also a structural danger.
The tortoise is waving her flag, which means we have to stop. And how a ThinkIn works, because it's effectively an editorial conference, is that today, me as the editor, I have to try and do epic shit. That's what a rule to live by. I have to try and summarise some of the things we've talked about, and actually there was a ton of stuff we didn't have time to get to. So I'll try to pull down some of the themes that we'll take forward as tortoise and to try and plug into our reporting. Gayle set out a really helpful rubric at the beginning, 3 kind of barriers. Firstly, where the idea of equality is voluntary for the most part. And it feels to me that we need to start chipping away at that as a default and find ways, whether they are through, monetary incentives and taxation, whether therefore through influencing and convincing business people that they're going to make more cash if they work in a different way, but to try and change the mechanism so that people are compelled to act. Secondly, we've talked quite a lot about measurements and metrics, measuring the cost of inaction, counting the value of unpaid care work. Katie's helpful thing just now about sort of voice, value and violence as a sort of interesting rule of 3 that we can all understand, and it's simple. There are certainly would seem to be ways to measure, and James's suggestion about mimicking the way that the sort of climate stick and carrot methodology for businesses become sort of more baked into the natural flow of things that 20 years ago would have been seen to be absolutely ludicrous, but now is accepted as a common sense and urgent and important thing to do, would seem to me to be a helpful suggestion. I think Nimco's made a powerful case for focusing in on a specific issue that is precise and purposeful and real, and not only real but also symbolic and a sort of catalytic a factor for other things, and in that case is FGM. But we've also touched on education, and I think the thing that I take away from this conversation is it's not just education full stop and the provision thereof, but the quality and nature of that education. And STEM has been mentioned a couple of times to say when we think about how we measure girls' access to, for example, secondary education, what are they being taught? Because the content of that education would seem to be as important as the availability of education itself, I think is really interesting. And then Mandu I made a really interesting comment that I wrote down, which is, for us here in London, really thinking about what do we incorporate as normal into our lives and what do we jettison as unacceptable is something that we kind of have to question. And some of the thoughts I had sort of in the lead up to this, it's sort of small things that have a big infrastructure behind them. Imagine if you were to, you know how when you buy, I don't know, food in the supermarket, you can tell how many calories are in it, or you can see if it's organic and those kinds of things. What if there were positive or negative kite marking on products in relation to the company that's manufactured them, sort of ability to deliver against gender equality commitments, or knowing that there's no slave labour in the supply chain, these kinds of things in an everyday life when you feel distant from the really difficult situations elsewhere, I think are all things that we need to kind of put back on the table. So it would feel to me that there's a ton of work to do. It would also feel to me that there is reason for optimism, but optimism isn't an end in itself. Clearly it has to be backed by action. Coming here today is an action, but I do hope that you will, A, vote for Mandy. I'm not meant to be political, but then Mandu for Mayor is the hashtag.
Vote for the Women's Equality Party.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's not all about me.
Keep in touch with the One campaign. They make it super, super easy on the website to sign up and engage with the campaigns and find access to the material. And the Five Foundation, which is Nimco's ongoing campaign to end FGM worldwide, is an important thing to be aware of and involved in, for all manner of reasons. So do your bit, I guess, is the message, and have a lovely Friday. Thank you for coming.